The morning sun had only begun to warm the edges of Houston's skyline when Jonathan Reed parked his old pickup near the service gate of the Stonewell estate. The air carried the faint scent of cut grass and morning dew, a quiet contrast to the life that waited beyond those iron gates. For most people, the Stonewell mansion was a symbol of success, an empire of marble and glass built by money and power. For Jonathan, it was just another place to keep clean. He had been working there for 3 years, a quiet figure who slipped through the halls unseen. The staff respected him. The guards nodded when he passed, and the Stonewell family barely remembered his name. He didn't mind. After a lifetime of noise and disappointment, invisibility was its own kind of peace. Each morning he followed the same rhythm: sweep, mop, polish, repeat until the day ended, and he could return to his small apartment on the south side of the city. But that morning was different. Jonathan was mopping the east corridor when he heard it. A faint, broken sound drifting from the upper level. It wasn't the echo of footsteps or a door closing. It was a cry, soft but filled with fear. He stopped, the mop handle firm in his hand, his head tilted toward the sound. For a long moment there was silence again. Then another whisper followed, barely audible yet desperate enough to chill his blood. "Please, help him." He froze. It was a young girl's voice. Without thinking, Jonathan leaned his mop against the wall and began walking toward the main staircase. The house was too quiet. Even the usual hum of distant conversation from the kitchen had gone silent. As he climbed, the familiar family portraits watched him, the proud face of Richard Stonewell, billionaire industrialist, hanging beside photographs of charity galas, board meetings, and handshakes with powerful people. Then his eyes caught a smaller frame, Amelia Stonewell, Richard's only daughter. She couldn't have been older than 16 in that picture, smiling with a confidence that came from never being told no. But Jonathan had seen her around the property once or twice, and that smile didn't seem to belong to her anymore. The sound came again, sharper this time. He followed it to the west wing, where the doors were usually locked. One door stood slightly ajar, light spilling through the narrow gap. Jonathan hesitated. The rules were clear. No one entered the family's private quarters. But rules meant nothing when someone was in trouble. He pushed the door open slowly. Inside was chaos. Papers scattered across the floor, a chair overturned, and in the middle of the room a man sat tied to another chair, his shirt torn, his face bruised. Jonathan's heart sank when he realized who it was: Charles Stonewell, the founder of the empire, the father of Richard Stonewell, and the man whose name adorned half the city. Jonathan had seen him in portraits, but here, stripped of power and surrounded by shadows, he looked fragile, almost human. Standing over him was Richard himself, the current head of the Stonewell Corporation, his expression cold, his voice low and venomous. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," Richard said. "If you'd just signed the documents, none of this would have happened." Charles's voice was weak but steady. "You're killing everything I built, Richard. Your greed will destroy us all." Richard's jaw tightened. "No, Father. I'm saving it from you." Jonathan's pulse quickened. He stepped back, careful not to make a sound. That was when he saw her, Amelia, hiding near the corner, tears streaking down her face, her small frame trembling. When her eyes met his, she didn't hesitate. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking, "help my dad. They're killing him." For a second, Jonathan couldn't move. This wasn't his fight. He was just the janitor. But the terror in that girl's voice broke something inside him, something he had buried long ago, the instinct to protect. He nodded silently, motioning for her to stay quiet. Then he stepped back into the hallway and pulled out his phone, dialing 911. Before he could press call, a heavy hand clamped on his shoulder. "You lost, old man?" Jonathan turned slowly. 2 security guards in black suits stood behind him, men he recognized from the estate. Their expressions left no doubt they'd heard enough. "I thought I heard something upstairs," Jonathan said evenly, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Mr. Stonewell doesn't like guests wandering up here," one guard said. "You should stick to cleaning." Jonathan forced a nod and turned away, walking down the hall, heart pounding. He needed to get help, but if the guards were already involved, calling the police might make things worse. The Stonewells owned half the city. People didn't go against them and survive their jobs. Still, he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen what he saw. When he reached the service hall, Amelia appeared again. She must have slipped away. Her eyes were red, her voice trembling. "They'll kill him if you don't do something," she said. "They're saying he's sick, but he's not. He's fine. My father just wants control of everything." Jonathan looked around to make sure they were alone. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "You need to hide somewhere safe. Don't go back upstairs." Amelia shook her head. "I can't leave him. You have to. If they find you, they'll—" "I don't care," she said, tears falling freely now. "You don't understand. He's my grandfather. He's the only one who ever cared about me." Jonathan stared at her. The weight of her words settled deep inside him. He had seen cruelty before. In war, in poverty, in boardrooms full of smiling men. But this was different. This was betrayal, bleeding inside a family too rich for truth. He took a slow breath. "All right, I'll help you. But you have to trust me." She nodded quickly. "I do." He led her through the service hallway toward the maintenance garage. Every step felt heavier than the last. If he got caught, it wouldn't just cost him his job, it could cost him his life. But when they reached the side door, Amelia froze. Through the glass, she saw 2 black SUVs parked near the gate. Men in suits stood nearby, talking into earpieces. "They're watching every exit," she whispered. Jonathan looked around, thinking fast. "There's another way out," he said. "Follow me." He guided her toward the basement where the old servant tunnels still connected to the outer grounds. The air smelled of dust and oil, but it was their only chance. As they descended the narrow stairs, Jonathan could hear footsteps echoing above them. The guards had realized someone was missing. Amelia grabbed his arm. "What if they catch us?" "They won't," he said quietly. "Just stay close." They moved through the dim corridor, their shadows stretching across the concrete walls. Jonathan led her to a hidden metal door covered by a shelf of paint cans. He pushed it open and cool air rushed in. "Go," he whispered. Amelia hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll draw them off. You keep running until you reach the back fence." "There's a gate that leads to the woods," her voice broke. "You're going to get caught." Jonathan gave a faint smile. "Better me than you." She didn't want to go, but she knew she had to. She slipped through the doorway and disappeared into the darkness outside. Jonathan closed the door behind her just as heavy footsteps reached the stairs. He turned, gripping the nearest tool, a steel wrench. 2 guards stormed down the steps, flashlights cutting through the gloom. "There!" one shouted. Jonathan didn't wait. He swung the wrench, catching the first man across the arm. The flashlight flew from his hand, clattering to the floor. The second guard lunged, but Jonathan ducked, driving his shoulder into the man's chest. They crashed into a shelf, tools and cans raining down. He ran for the far exit, heart hammering, lungs burning. Behind him, the guards shouted into their radios. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever, but maybe he didn't have to. If Amelia made it out, if she reached someone she could trust, there might still be a chance to save her grandfather. That was all that mattered. When Jonathan reached the end of the corridor, he paused long enough to catch his breath. He could hear the distant roar of engines outside, the sharp bark of orders shouted into radios. He had bought her a few precious minutes. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. The woods swallowed Amelia in a tangle of trunks and underbrush, and for a long, breathless minute, Jonathan watched only the place where she had disappeared. The estate lights glittered behind him like a distant city. The SUVs were still a dark blot by the gate. He heard the frantic rattle of radios somewhere up the slope. Men searching, voices clipped and mechanical with authority. He had not trained for chases anymore. Had not run in years, but the old muscles remembered, and the world narrowed to one rhythm. Move, breathe, move. He shoved his hands into his pockets and forced himself to follow the path he had shown the girl, a narrow deer run that skirted the property line. Night sharpened the edges of things. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs. He kept his steps quiet, at first because stealth was the only protection he could think of. Later because each soft footfall made his heart ache less. Amelia's small shoes had left muffled prints on the soft earth. He used them like a thread to follow. When he rounded a fallen oak and saw her silhouette beneath a stand of pines, huddled, shivering, clutching her backpack, a raw, unexpected relief washed through him. "You made it," he said, forcing his voice to be nothing more than a rustle. She looked up as if she had not heard anything louder than the wind in the trees. Her pupils were enormous, and for a moment she seemed older than 16. "You ran farther than I thought you would," he added, attempting a dry humor that came out flat. She managed a small, exhausted smile and then folded into silence again. She held out her hand and he gave her the small flashlight he carried in his pocket. She clicked it on with fumbling fingers as if blessing a talisman. They moved north, away from the Stonewell Drive, stepping into thicker cover and quieter roads. Once they reached a service track that led toward a forgotten neighborhood of industrial lots, he slowed and let her rest. She sat on a mossy culvert and leaned her head back against the concrete, eyes closed. In the shelter of the old warehouses and corrugated roofs, they were small and invisible. Yet nowhere felt safe. He thought of calling someone, the police, a friend, anything. But the name of the estate made his throat close. The Stonewells had influence. Calling the authorities could make the wolf howl louder and bring more men with badges and answers that never came. "Tell me everything," he said. Why would they do that to him? She opened her eyes. For a split second, the child was all that remained. A girl who had been dragged into a world of adult calculations and cruelty, and then the iron resolve returned. "They're reorganizing," she said. "Dad said Grandpa was getting soft. They want control, sign a transfer of assets, change the will. Fiona, Mr. Langley. Someone high up told them to push. Grandpa said no. Then things started being different. People who used to smile stopped smiling. He started disappearing from dinners. He started locking his door." She swallowed. "Then last night they took him. They said he had to sign to avoid scandal. They locked his phone. I overheard them. Threats about bleeding the company dry, threats about names I didn't recognize. I ran to find help, but the guards wouldn't listen. I tried to go to the gate. A man pushed me back. They said he was sick. They said he was confused. But he's not." Jonathan listened, listening not only to the words but to what lay between them, the worn voice that had learned to swallow fear for the sake of others. The way she kept tightening her fists as if to stop herself from collapsing. When she said the names, one faintly, clicked in the dark part of his memory like rust in a lock. He had cleaned offices where those names were carved into plaques. Outside conference rooms engraved on boards of directors. This was not petty family cruelty. It was corporate hunger dressed as necessity. "We need to get him somewhere safe," he said. "Do you know where they've taken him?" She shook her head. "They said the executive wing, but later someone mentioned sublevel. I don't know. I only know the door where they left him." The study. There were men with radios. One had a face like a map, scarred. "I heard a name, Kestrel, but maybe I'm making it up." "Kestrel," he repeated. The name rubbed across a memory he had tried to keep buried. An old code name, spoken in classified briefings long before he had traded uniforms for mops. He had been good at forgetting, at folding things away. Sometimes the past is a tool you put in a locked box, but names had a way of making boxes open. He kept it to himself for the moment and focused again on the practical. "We can't go back to your house. They're watching exits. We go to my place for now. Small apartment, 2 blocks from the South Line. I can patch you up, give you something to eat. Then we plan." She wiped her cheeks with the back of a hand. "You sure you want to do this? You could get in trouble." "I've been in trouble my whole life," he said, neither lightly nor tragically. It was simply a fact. Tonight doesn't change the ledger. They moved like ghosts through empty lots and alleys, avoiding the main roads and the surveillance cameras he knew dotted the approach to the highway. Wherever the Stonewells' money met municipal upkeep, the lenses watched with patient, dispassionate eyes. Jonathan knew how to read their blind spots. The two of them crossed an old creek on a fallen beam and entered the back of a laundromat, then a low-traffic neighborhood where the apartments smelled of fried foods and cheap detergent. He led Amelia up several flights and into a narrow building whose hallway smelled faintly of bleach and the city, ordinary things that were a kind of shelter. Inside his small unit, he moved with swift, practical rhythm. He found extra blankets, a thermos of coffee, and when Amelia collapsed on the couch, her exhaustion seemed to rearrange her face into something simpler, less caged. He boiled water and wrapped slices of stale bread in foil. She ate like someone who had not been allowed to eat at ease in days. While she ate, he checked her for cuts, forgetting for a moment his own shoulder that had taken a blow when he escaped the guards. There were fingernail marks on her forearms and a bruise near the temple. She winced when he ran a cool cloth along the bruise. "So you used to be," she began, eyes flicking toward his old duffel propped against the closet. He had not planned to explain anything tonight, but the truth was a kind of relief. "A soldier? A medic?" She finished. He nodded shortly. I was a field medic. Left the Corps 9 years ago. Kept my hands clean with this job after. You don't want to be a soldier when you don't have to be one. The world takes a different toll when you're paying scrubbing in the daytime. Why did you leave? She asked plainly, not prying so much as orienting herself to the man who had become her guardian in a night. He looked at the scar along the knuckle of his right hand. Because someone I loved didn't come home. Because I got tired of the cause being a map without borders. Because some things you see don't leave you until you do something about them or they crumble you. Which is a circle back to why we're here now. He said it quietly. He did not need to dress the sentiment. Amelia finished her bread and set the tin cup aside. My grandfather once told me stories about his grandfather, she said, voice soft. He said sometimes people in power forget there's a world outside the marble, and when they do, people disappear. I thought he was telling me fiction. Her smile was gone. I was wrong. They sat for an hour in an easy silence, plotting nothing and everything. Where she could go next, who might be trusted, how to contact anyone without the Stonewell Reach noticing. The obvious allies, federal authorities, old friends, were compromised by the scale of the power they faced. The Stonewell name was a currency worth more than money. It bought silence, prosecutors, and quiet police calls. They needed information, leverage, and time. Time was the only thing Jonathan could not make from thin air, but he could buy it. At 2 a.m, a soft knock came at the door. Jonathan tensed first, then relaxed when the voice outside was not the clipped tone of a security detail, but warm and hushed. You forgot your spare key, Cass said, slipping inside before he could respond. Cass was a woman he had worked alongside a few nights, a retired communications technician who lived 2 floors below. She walked with the assurance of someone whose fingers had coaxed radios and rerouted lines. She had the habit of being useful. You scared me to death, Amelia said, surprised to see another adult. How did you even… Heartbeat, Cass said simply. I heard you in the stairwell. Old building? It carries sound like a tin heart? She looked at Jonathan with a question in her eyes, the kind that demanded the short version. He gave it without bells. A glance, the nod toward the laundry bag where Amelia's backpack lay, then the hurried update on men, the study, the broken chair. Cass's expression closed like a gate, the kind that sealed when someone decided to commit. Listen, she said, practical and precise. You don't want the cops. This is going to be messy. I can get you a burner phone, a safe email link. I can do minor comm tracing, nothing fancy. But I know someone who can look deeper without a warrant or a headline. She owes me a favor from 10 years ago. Cass curled her fingers and noted something on the back of her wrist. 2 hours, she said. No more, no less before she checks in. Who? Amelia asked. Cassandra Lowe. Old counter intel ghosted the system. If anyone can dig in hands-free, it's her. Cass's face was flat. She had seen national problems at close range and learned to measure hope by the size of the footsteps it took to pursue it. They leaned into a plan that was small and dangerous. A call, an ask, a whisper into a network of ex-intelligence operators who owed each other debts and kept one another alive. It was the kind of thing that happened off the books. No memos, no legal authority. Just people who remembered how to keep each other breathing. When Cass left, the apartment fell into a different silence. Jonathan and Amelia sat on opposite ends of the couch and watched the moon carve a pale path across the floorboards. He thought of the chair in the study, of the way Charles Stonewell had looked when tied and bleeding. He thought of the gilded portraits in that quiet hallway and the way power could make men cruel. For a long minute he allowed himself the memory of Nia, his niece gone, and the cold resolve that had replaced grief. He was not a man looking for glory. He was not a man blind to stakes. He simply knew the arithmetic of a life owed. You ever want to quit this? Amelia asked suddenly, looking small and ridiculous and brave at once. Being the person who fixes things no one notices? He cocked a small smile. Every morning when I mop the East Corridor, she laughed. It broke something in the room open, just enough that hope slid in like light, and though the laughter faded, he felt it settle like a small temporary shield. They slept in fits, Jonathan on the couch, one eye listening for engines, the other keeping watch on a sleeping child he had decided to guard. Dawn found them packing into an old sedan Cass had arranged. The sky was a bruised gray and the city smelled of rain. Cass kept them pointed toward a safe house outside the county, an old farmhouse owned by a man who, like most of Cass's friends, lived beneath the radar, It was the kind of place where one could exist without constant observation. Satellite blind spots, no cell towers within range, an old landline that was both a blessing and a trap. On the drive, Cass spoke of counsel, of who to contact and who to avoid. "Don't speak to anyone," she said. "And for God's sake, leave your social error behind. They are going to try to frame you. They will weaponize whatever they can find." They took back roads that wound past factories and fields, the city shrinking behind them until it was only a skyline of memory. As they drove, the chatter on Cass's encrypted comm line cracked with levers pulled by invisible hands. A friend in Michigan, a patch used to reroute, an ex-officer checking lines. All small things that, in a week, might become a quilt of protection. For now it was thread and prayer. At the farmhouse, a woman named Mara greeted them at the door without surprise. She had eyes like someone who'd learned to see what people tried to hide, and a smile that did not invite questions. She ushered Amelia to a spare room, brought out warm blankets, and poured tea that seemed to warm the bones. Jonathan sat by the stove and listened to wind through bare branches. The world had tilted, and yet in that tilt there was direction. If the Stonewells had plans, someone had better plans too. Cass returned from a call and sat down at the kitchen table. "She'll come," she said. "Cassandra will come. And if she can't, I have a node that will start leaking to a journalist with an intact moral compass. Not the tabloids, somebody who will actually run with files. But that path is riskier. We prefer the intel route." Night settled hard and fast. For the first time since Amelia had slipped past the study door, she slept with no nightmares. Whether she was relieved or exhausted, Jonathan couldn't tell. He sat on the porch and watched the horizon, thinking of the study and the man bound to a chair in the dark, watching power drink truth like water. He thought of how many people, how many silent janitors, were at the edges of the world waiting for a chance to right wrongs, waiting for a single voice to ask for help. When the call came at midnight, Cassandra's voice was a rasp and a hush at once. "I'm on my way," she said, no explanation necessary. "Tell him to be ready. The name you heard is real. Kestrel's been in the shadows since before your grandfather's first suit." Jonathan felt a cold steadiness spread through him like iron. The world had shifted axis. They were no longer cleaning up messes. They were standing in the center of one. And for the first time in a long while, he welcomed the storm. The next morning bled pale light across the farmhouse windows, thin and cold. Jonathan had barely slept. His body still ached from the fight, but it was the silence that kept him awake, the kind that presses on the chest when the world is about to change. He brewed coffee on the wood stove, the smell cutting through the damp air, and waited for Cassandra to arrive. Amelia came into the kitchen wrapped in a blanket. "Any word?" she asked. "Soon," Jonathan said. Cass said her contact was already on the road. At 8 o'clock, a dusty SUV rolled down the gravel drive.
The woman who stepped out looked nothing like a legend.
She wore jeans, a gray hoodie, and sunglasses despite the overcast sky, yet the way she moved, deliberate, controlled, told Jonathan that Cass's stories hadn't been exaggerations. Cassandra Lowe had been part of an intelligence unit that no longer officially existed. She entered without ceremony, set a laptop on the kitchen table, and got to work. "I pulled what I could overnight," she said. "Richard Stonewell's private holdings, dummy subsidiaries, offshore accounts. There's a pattern of transfers that all link to a shell company named Kestrel Dynamics. That's not a coincidence," Jonathan frowned. "What does it do?" "On paper? Consulting. In reality, it moves money and information for people who can't afford to be seen dealing with each other." She tapped a key and a cluster of charts appeared on the screen. "Your employer has been funding a parallel operation, buying research from government labs, military prototypes, biogen data. Charles Stonewell was trying to stop it. That's why they turned on him." Amelia stared at the screen, her face pale. "So they're stealing from their own company?" "Worse," Cassandra said. "They're selling to foreign bidders. The contracts are worth billions. If Charles refused to sign, they needed him out of the way." Jonathan leaned forward. "Alive or dead? Doesn't matter to them," she said flatly. "A forged signature and a cremation certificate can buy silence. The only thing they didn't expect was you, kid." Amelia's hands tightened around her mug. "We have to tell someone." Cass shook her head. "Not yet. Without proof, they'll bury you both. We need data, real files, timestamps, transfers. Those sit in the Stonewell servers behind biometric locks." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "Then we go back. The table went quiet. Cass looked from him to Amelia. "That's suicide." "Maybe," he said. "But we don't have a choice." Cassandra Lowe studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "All right. If you're going back, you'll need an entry plan. I can spoof the security feed for 12 minutes. After that, every alarm in that mansion will scream." Amelia's voice was steady now. "Then we finish before that." They spent the rest of the day drawing the map. Cassandra laid out blueprints she'd hacked from a city planning archive. Jonathan annotated them with janitorial routes and maintenance tunnels he knew by heart. The plan was brutally simple. Infiltrate through the old tunnel, access the sublevel, extract data from the server room, and get out before the window closed. By evening, the rain started again, a steady rhythm against the roof that made the farmhouse feel like a heartbeat. Cass soldered a small device onto a circuit board. Her ghost key, she called it, while Jonathan cleaned and wrapped his injured shoulder. Amelia watched them both, memorizing every movement as if storing courage. At midnight, they left. The road back to the city was slick, headlights slicing through mist. Jonathan drove, eyes fixed ahead. Amelia sat beside him, silent, her face set with the same determination he'd seen the night she begged him for help. Cass followed in the SUV, her equipment glowing faintly through the windows. When they reached the outskirts of the Stonewell estate, the sky was ink black. The security lights swept in predictable arcs. Jonathan had counted them 100 times over the years. He parked behind a line of pines, killed the engine, and turned to Amelia. "Once we're in, stay behind me. No noise, no hesitation. You see something wrong, you run," she nodded. "What about you?" He gave a small, tired smile. "I'm harder to kill than I look." They slipped through the fence, mud soaking their shoes, and found the old tunnel grate half buried under weeds. Jonathan pried it open with a crowbar, and they crawled into the dark. The tunnel smelled of rust and forgotten years. Their flashlights drew narrow cones of light that bounced off damp concrete. Far above, the mansion slept under its blanket of wealth and secrets. Halfway through, Cass's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Ghost Key's live. 12 minutes starts now." Jonathan's pulse settled into a calm rhythm. He moved faster, guiding Amelia through twists and ladders until they reached the sub-level maintenance door. The keypad blinked red until he swiped his stolen badge. Then the light turned green. They slipped inside. The sub-level was colder than he remembered. Metal corridors, humming servers, the low electric buzz of power that never slept. They moved between rows of cabinets until Cassandra's voice whispered again. "North wall, third rack. Plug the drive." Amelia knelt, hands shaking only slightly, and inserted the ghost key. Lines of code streamed across her small screen, and the progress bar crawled upward. Jonathan kept watch by the door. Minutes passed like hours. Somewhere above them, a door slammed. He heard faint voices, then boots. He whispered, 2 minutes. "Almost there," Amelia breathed. The bar hit 98% when the alarms erupted. Sudden, piercing, all-consuming. The lights strobed red, bathing the room in pulses of warning. Cass shouted through the comm, "I lost the feed!" "Get out now!" Jonathan grabbed the drive, yanked Amelia to her feet, and ran. Guards poured into the corridor, guns raised. The first shot cracked the air and ricocheted off metal. Sparks exploded near Jonathan's shoulder. He ducked, pulled Amelia behind a server bank, then hurled a wrench toward the far wall to draw fire. The distraction bought them seconds. They sprinted for the maintenance stairwell. Bullets rattled against the steel rails as Jonathan slammed the stairwell door behind them. The echo of gunfire bounced up the shaft, followed by the bark of orders. He took the steps 2 at a time, lungs burning, his hand tight around Amelia's wrist. When they burst through the top landing, the corridor ahead was empty. Polished tile, mirrored glass, the deceptive calm of the upper floor. "This way," he hissed. They sprinted toward the old archive room at the west wing, one of the few places without live cameras. Jonathan had cleaned it for years. He knew its blind corners better than anyone else. Inside, he shoved a filing cabinet across the doorway, blocking the line of sight. Amelia clutched the flash drive to her chest. "Did we get it?" He nodded. "Enough to ruin them if we can get it out." Her breathing steadied. She was no longer the frightened girl he'd met in the hallway. Fear had burned into resolve. Jonathan looked at her and saw for the first time the steel her grandfather must have recognized. Outside, boots thundered along the marble. Voices, sharp, disciplined, fanned out. The security chief, Kestrel himself, was barking commands. Jonathan recognized the tone of a man who had once worked military contracts. Efficient, ruthless. Cass's voice crackled in their ears again. Backup plan. North elevator, service bay 2. I can spoof it for 30 seconds. After that, you're on your own. They moved. The hallways blurred. Portraits, chandeliers, the echo of alarms until the polished steel doors of the service elevator loomed ahead. Jonathan hit the call button. It opened instantly, Cass's ghost key doing its last work. They stepped inside, the doors closing just as 2 guards turned the corner. The elevator descended in silence. Amelia exhaled a shaking laugh that wasn't quite relief. You really used to do this for a living? Different halls, same noise, he said. When the doors slid open again, they were in the underground garage. Cass's SUV idled at the far end, headlights off, engine barely a whisper. Jonathan guided Amelia toward it, keeping low between concrete pillars. A shout rang out, someone had seen them. He pushed Amelia ahead. Run! They dove into the SUV and Cass gunned the engine. Tires screamed against wet concrete as the vehicle shot up the ramp. 2 black sedans swung into pursuit, their beams slicing through the rain. Cass swerved onto the access road, headlights still off, letting the night swallow them. For several miles, no one spoke. Only the rhythmic slap of wipers and the growl of the engine filled the space. Finally, Cass said, We have the data, but they know it. You just declared war on Stonewell Industries. Jonathan looked back at Amelia. She was staring out the window, face reflected in streaks of water and light. Then let's finish it, she said quietly. Cass nodded once. We'll need allies. People who still believe in the truth. Jonathan's gaze shifted to the flash drive resting on Amelia's lap. And we have the proof to buy them. By the time dawn broke again, they had crossed 2 counties and parked the SUV behind a shuttered truck depot. The building smelled of oil and rain. Cass spread a blanket across a workbench and laid out her laptop and drives like surgical tools. We move fast, she said. Once we upload this, we can't take it back. The world will know who the Stonewells really are. Amelia watched her fingers blur across the keyboard. Every few seconds, lines of code spilled down the screen. Firewalls bypassed, files decrypted, timestamps locked. Jonathan stood guard by the doorway, listening to the distant hum of trucks on the interstate. He had been in plenty of battles, but none like this. There was no uniform, no front line, only the thin air between truth and annihilation. When the upload reached 50%, a low rumble shook the floor. Cass looked up sharply. They found us. Headlights cut through the dirty windows, 2 SUVs, same matte black as before. Jonathan pulled Amelia down behind the workbench. Stay low. The first impact blew the door inward. Splinters flew. Jonathan rolled aside, drew the small pistol he had taken from a fallen guard the night before and fired twice. 1 man dropped. The other fell back behind a column. Cass snatched the laptop, slammed it shut, and shoved it into her pack. 80%. That's all we need, she hissed. They slipped out a side door into the rain-soaked yard. Bullets sparked off the metal siding as they sprinted toward the far fence. Jonathan boosted Amelia over first, then Cass. He followed last, landing hard on the other side. They tumbled into weeds, gasping. Behind them, the depot glowed red as the SUV's headlights converged. They ran until their legs ached. At the edge of a drainage ditch, Cass stopped, bent double, and laughed, a short, breathless sound. We're still alive, she said. That counts for something. Jonathan checked the laptop. The indicator light still blinked. It finished, he said quietly. The files transmitted before we ran, Cass grinned. Then it's already out there. They reached the safe house at dawn. News was already spreading across the morning feeds. Leaked documents, offshore accounts, confidential memos connecting Stonewell Industries to illegal defense contracts. The story was everywhere, bigger than any of them had hoped. Reporters camped outside the Stonewell headquarters demanding statements. Stock values plunged. Amelia sat at the kitchen table watching the screen, her face unreadable. What happens to him now? She asked. Jonathan didn't have to ask who she meant. He'll try to deny everything, but the board won't back him forever. Cass poured coffee into 3 chipped mugs. There'll be investigations, hearings. They'll find your grandfather, too. With that kind of pressure, they'll have to. The next days unfolded like a storm. Footage leaked. Videos of Charles Stonewell being moved under guard. Documents signed under duress. Voice recordings of Richard ordering Kestrel to secure the legacy. Each hour peeled away another layer of the Empire's armor. When federal agents finally raided the estate, the cameras caught Richard Stonewell in handcuffs. The image looped across every channel. The billionaire's son, once untouchable, reduced to a man shielding his eyes from the flash of cameras. Amelia watched silently. When the news announced that Charles had been found alive in a private medical wing, she covered her mouth and began to cry. Jonathan put a hand on her shoulder, not to comfort her but to steady himself. Sometimes justice hurt as much as mercy. A week later, they stood outside the hospital. Charles was frail but awake, his hand trembling when he reached for Amelia's. "You saved me," he said. She shook her head. "We all did." He looked past her at Jonathan. "And you, why did you help us?" Jonathan answered honestly, "Because no one else would." Charles smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from gratitude deeper than words. "Then I owe you more than a debt. I owe you a future." The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet hope. For the first time in weeks, Amelia slept without flinching. Charles Stonewell's room overlooked the Houston skyline. Beyond the glass, the city looked smaller, humbled. Reporters waited on the sidewalk below, chasing fragments of the scandal that had swallowed the Empire whole. Inside, the room was still. Charles watched his granddaughter breathe, the rise and fall of her chest slower now, peaceful. When Jonathan entered, the older man's eyes softened. "You were the janitor," Charles said, his voice little more than a whisper. Jonathan nodded. "Still am in a way. Just change what I'm cleaning up." A ghost of a laugh escaped the old man. "Every empire needs someone like you. Someone who still knows right from wrong when the rest of us forget." Jonathan shook his head. "Empires don't need me. People do." For several minutes they sat without speaking. The machines ticked softly. Rain tapped the window. Charles broke the silence. "Richard will spend years trying to rewrite what happened. There'll be lawyers, statements, boards pretending they didn't know. But the truth is out, and once truth breathes air, it never dies." Jonathan watched the skyline. "Then let it live." A nurse entered to check the monitors, nodding politely before leaving again. When she was gone, Charles reached for the envelope resting on the table beside him. "These are controlling shares of the foundation I built. They were meant for my son, but he traded integrity for greed. I want them in Amelia's name, protected by a trust that answers to no one inside the corporation. Help her manage it, if you will." Jonathan hesitated. "I'm not a businessman." "No," Charles said. "You're a good man. That's rarer." Outside the window, clouds thinned and sunlight broke across the towers like forgiveness. Jonathan left the room quietly and found Cass in the corridor talking to two agents. She handed over a small drive and signed the last affidavit. "They've got everything," she said. "Kestrel disappeared before the raid. They'll find him eventually." Jonathan looked down the hall where Amelia was waking beside her grandfather. "They'll try to rebuild," he said. "Then we make sure they rebuild it right," Cass replied. They walked out together into the cold morning air. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward, but neither answered. They kept walking until the noise faded behind them. Months passed before Houston stopped talking about the Stonewells. Headlines moved on, but the fallout had changed the city in ways numbers could not measure. Factories reopened under new charters. The foundation began funding community schools instead of lobby dinners. And for the first time in years, people inside the corporation spoke without lowering their voices. Amelia ran it all from a modest office downtown. The grand portrait of her father that had once dominated the lobby was gone. In its place hung a single framed photograph. Her grandfather shaking hands with a group of factory workers the day production restarted. She refused interviews, choosing instead to let the work speak. When reporters did find her, she only said, "We're rebuilding trust one promise at a time." Jonathan kept his word and stayed by her side for the first year, quietly guiding from the background. He handled logistics, staff, the small decisions that determined whether a dream survived the day-to-day grind. He never touched a boardroom seat. He preferred the warehouse floor where new shipments rolled out for public housing projects. People came to know him simply as Mr. Reed, the man who got things done. Cass visited often, sometimes staying for coffee, sometimes leaving with a new encrypted drive of documents to keep watch on the remaining traces of Kestrel. Her humor never softened, but the circles under her eyes faded. She had found purpose again. One late afternoon, A year to the week after the rescue, Jonathan stood on the same stretch of sidewalk where he had first watched the mansion gates close behind him. The estate was quiet now, converted into a rehabilitation center funded by the new Stonewell Foundation. Through the iron bars, he saw workers planting trees where the marble fountain had once stood. Amelia approached beside him, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up from a day in the field. "Grandpa wanted you to have this," she said, handing him a small box. Inside lay a silver watch, its back engraved with simple words, "For the man who remembered what mattered." Jonathan turned it over in his hand. "I can't take this." "You already did," she said with a smile. "It's yours as long as you keep showing up." They watched the workers for a while. The sky burned gold over the city. The sound of hammers echoed like a heartbeat. Amelia looked at him, eyes steady. "Do you ever regret helping me?" He thought about all of it. The chase through the tunnels, the gunfire, the nights hiding in safe houses, the faces of men who thought money could buy eternity. Then he shook his head. "Not for a second," she nodded slowly. "Neither do I." As the sun sank, Jonathan walked away from the gates and back toward the bus stop. The city lights flickered on one by one like quiet testaments to resilience. He boarded the bus, took a seat by the window, and watched Houston slide past. Streets cleaner, people busier, a few smiles where once there had been only indifference. He had become invisible again, but now invisibility felt like peace, not exile. He checked the time on the silver watch, then looked out at the skyline and allowed himself the smallest smile. There were still floors to mop, people to help, and messes to clean. But tonight, at least, justice had been done. And somewhere behind the city's glass and steel, a young woman was building something honest in place of what her family had destroyed. That was enough.